On behalf of the ISC MHPSS reference group and its thematic working group on MHPSS and peace building, it is my very great pleasure to welcome you all to this latest in our series of webinars on the intersection between the two fields of MHPSS and peace building. Could I have the next slide, please? For those of you who are not yet familiar with the ISC MHPSS reference group, it was established in December 2007 and consists of currently of more than 50 members and represents a sort of a unique collaboration between NGOs, UN, international agencies, and academics coming together to promote best practices in MHPSS. Next, please. The reference group works through thematic working groups to facilitate the development and dissemination of guidance in specific areas. And the working group that is organizing the webinar today on MHPSS and peace building is one of these. It was established in February 2019 and is currently co-chaired by GIZ and UNFPA, with members from agencies working in very diverse contexts across the world. And the group's work is currently focused on trying to strengthen linkages between MHPSS and peace building through the development of practical guidance. And at the end of this webinar, I will share with you an invitation to participate in that process of development of guidance, but also through facilitation of technical discussions and exchanges like this webinar series. We're delighted today. Next, please. Yes, thanks. We're really delighted that one of our members, Heide Reeder from IOM, will be moderating presentations from some of her colleagues based in Iraq. And without further ado, I'd like to invite Heide to take over the session and introduce everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Ananda, for that kind introduction, and thank you all for joining us today for this webinar on MHPSS and livelihood integration using the example of IOM Iraq. I remember, Ananda, when we discussed the preparation of the webinar, and we were thinking about how does it fit into the webinar series, which is called MHPSS and peace building. We were discussing, is that really something that contributes to the broader peace building outcomes, or is it more something we call normally mainstreaming? And I took this question back to the team, and because I really think that the livelihood integration approach has a lot to do actually with community stabilization and contributes to peace building efforts in a country. And so we thought it's worth it sharing it with colleagues who are interested in looking at a specific topic of recovery and stabilization programming, which is livelihood. And I'm very pleased to be joined by the IOM Iraq team here today, who's going to present us the specific approach that has been developed in IOM Iraq. And I think it's interesting for a lot of colleagues who are actually working on elements like infrastructure, livelihood integration, as well as supporting communities through dialogue and other stabilization activities. And I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. So throughout the presentations, please feel free to add your comments and questions that hopefully we will be able to look at the end of our conversation. So I don't want to spend more time on the introduction, but rather introduce Hatem Mazouk, our first speaker. Can you see Hatem? Maybe you can change a bit you can only see half of your face. Can you maybe change a little bit the camera? Here we go, here it is. So Hatem is joining us. And let me introduce him. Hatem is the MHPSS program coordinator in IOM Iraq. He chairs also the country's MHPSS technical working group, capacity building and human resources working committee. It's a specific working group that has been developed there. And he has several years of experience in planning, developing and conducting capacity building activities in MHPSS and supporting crisis affected population. So Hatem is a medical doctor specialized in psychiatry and has a diploma in international mental health policy from Lisbon Institute. And he has a background in, as I said earlier, in academia, teaching mental health and psychiatry to medical students and trainees, nurses, and psychologists. So Hatem, I invite you to tell us a bit more about IOM Iraq's MHPSS program to maybe get an idea on which context you're working in, and also about what I mentioned earlier, the community stabilization programming that IOM Iraq is running. To see also maybe or explore further how this is actually linked to peace building efforts in the country. And afterwards, I will come back to Hatem before I introduce our second speaker, Julie Meyer, who's going to present to us the approach, the way it is implemented in Iraq. Hatem, over to you. You're welcome to continue with the presentation.
Thank you very much, Heidi, for this presentation. It's really my pleasure today to be here today to present about IOM's work on mental health and psychosocial support and livelihoods integration. As you said, I would like to give a quick overview on the mental health and psychosocial support that IOM has in Iraq, and how is it one of the tools that we use for the purpose of social cohesion, community stabilization, and peace building. And then I will also run through the process of starting the program, how the idea has initially set, and then maybe hand over to my colleague Julie to talk about the pilot program and the implementation. So in IOM, the MHPSS program in Iraq has been active since 2010, with obviously an increased presence since 2014. And throughout this period, the program has evolved from just an emergency focused intervention or program that addressed as an emergency situation to one that extended to other areas where the MHPSS activities have been implemented in collaboration with health, protection, social cohesion, livelihoods, and several other areas of activity in Iraq. So really evolving through just being provided in the sites of displacement or where IDPs are, to other areas as well of implementation. And more particularly since 2019, IOM Iraq has included the MHPSS program under the Community Stabilization Unit portfolio. So we've become more closely working with the social cohesion, peace building, tribal engagement, and prevention of violent extremism teams. And the idea was to bank on the existing links that the MHPSS program has with the community and the trust that they had in the MHPSS services provided by IOM before, and build on that to branch out to more sensitive areas of programming that would normally require more community trust. And another reason as well was also the skills that the MHPSS could bring to the table, especially on how MHPSS intersects with the other areas of programming, such as the group dynamics, enhancement, resilience, and improvement of the collective well-being in communities. So in total, we have about 200 staff members in the field, between community focal points, facilitators, people who are providing services to more than 15,000 individuals per year, and this has been ongoing since 2015. Next slide, please. Now, the other side of the story is IOM's general interest in MHPSS and livelihoods integration at organizational level, as well as IOM's work towards enhancing the support provided by MHPSS to the Transition and Recovery Division portfolio, which is something that Heidi is doing at the moment. So this also includes providing MHPSS technical knowledge and expertise to the peace building, social cohesion, community stabilization, and other related fields. So this manual, I think many of you could possibly be familiar with, is the IOM Manual on Community-Based MHPSS and Emergencies and Displacement that was published in 2019. And there's a whole chapter dedicated to the MHPSS and livelihoods integration. And it details how can the programs aiming at the integration exercise go about that. And the manual will be also shared as one of the resources that will be shared today after the webinar among other resources that hopefully will be useful to the participants. And it's also one of the things that we've based our program upon. Next slide, please. Another background to the Community Stabilization Unit in IO in Iraq. So the unit was formed with the objective of creating conditions for better social, economic, and political life by contributing to restoring the basic rights and security. The approach required that we address the drivers of conflict and displacement through a community-driven and led approach that would hopefully promote the resilience, social cohesion, improve the mental health and psychosocial well-being in the target areas. And this was also believed to be helpful in empowering marginalized individuals or groups, promoting social cohesion, more functioning state governance, non-violent political processes, and effective social policy and peace building. So this has given us the foundation, really working very closely with those teams to explore areas where we can link the MHPSS with livelihoods and the other areas that are on the community stabilization side. Next slide, please. So I think one of the key or the pivotal points in today's presentation is linking the integrated MHPSS approach to peace building and conflict resolution. And to clarify a little bit our proposed model, we looked at Gatlung's conflict triangle, which suggests two levels of conflict, a manifest one and a latent one. So the latent one describes the deep-rooted thoughts that people hold to, which could incite conflicts, whereas the manifest level would point more towards the exhibited actions that would contribute to incitement of conflict. So in this model, we are attempting to link behaviors like violence, war, genocide, and others which are obviously at the behavioral level to the factors on the latent level, either attitudes and assumptions such as discrimination, lack of intercommunity trust, nepotism, or on the conflict or contradiction side, which in our case is the scarce economic resources and opportunities. And the reason we particularly focused on those areas is that working in Iraq and being in contact with the community, those are very commonly quoted and described as potential drivers of violence, drivers of war or conflict between communities. So we thought it might be an interesting opportunity to look at whether, if we look at both the attitudes and assumptions, and C, the conflict and the contradiction, there would be a potential to maximize the outcome of an intervention that would address both the economic side, which in this case would be a livelihoods intervention, and the attitudes and assumption side, which would be covered by a mix of the activities addressing the social cohesion, conflict resolution, and MHPSS. And we wanted to examine how the livelihoods opportunities, which are obviously excellent ones to generate income, creating a sense of financial independence and addressing, the level one of the pyramid, if we're looking at the IAC pyramid, by satisfying the basic needs, could also be a vehicle for MHPSS interventions that address the social cohesion, well-being, and community stabilization overall. Next slide, please. So to summarize the intended outcome of the intervention, we are hoping to see the MHPSS activities being integrated into livelihoods activities in a more regular way, beyond the fact that there are referrals back and forth between the two programs, which is not what we're proposing or looking at here. So we're really looking at maximizing the impact of the opportunities beyond referral systems, beyond providing both services, but really trying to look at the both the economic and the basic needs on one side, and helping create more chances for empathy, inter-community trust, creative problem solving in the form of this integrated MHPSS and livelihoods program. And we thereby are hoping to achieve more peace strengthening behaviors, have more community reconciliation opportunities and meaningful exposure between the communities, as well as overall well-being benefits of MHPSS that we be provided. Next slide, please. And now moving on a little bit from theory to practice. So just again, preparing for the next part that Julie will talk about, it's important to say that Iraq has, as many already know, has been a country affected by decades of conflict, where about 6 million people have been IDPs between 2014 and 2021. And just this year in February, the number still stands at 1.3 million, which is quite a significant figure. And it's also worth mentioning that the conflict dynamics vary greatly from one geographic area to another within the country. And thereby, as we were looking to initiate the MHPSS and Livelihoods integration programs, we tried to look at locations where we can also examine more closely the approach and whether it could be conducive to community stabilization. And to be honest, we were not surprised that around 60 to 70% of the participants in the MHPSS needs assessments that we conduct normally prior to starting our programs have expressed a strong interest in livelihood opportunities as a potential tool to improve their well-being. So, and I think Julie will talk more to that, we also focused on how can MHPSS be also a way or a tool that people can use to improve the chances of the success of their businesses or livelihood opportunities. Next slide. So we started this in 2020, and like many things that were deprioritized by the COVID-19 pandemic, our kickstart was delayed to July, and we were finally able to get to the ground, to the field, and start the first community consultations and needs assessments in 4 governorates in the north and center of Iraq, which are Dahuk, Kirkuk, Ninawa, and Salah ad-Din, conducting a total of 306 key informant interviews, as well as 46 focus group discussions, which took us a few months to complete, really, with some of the activities being affected by access restrictions. And the result of this assessment is also available, and I believe it will be one of the resources that will be shared in the chat box for your reference. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is my last slide before handing over back to Heide. So the second part of the community consultation and needs assessment was conducted between October and December 2020, so quite recent, really. And we moved a little bit more towards the south of Iraq, where generally there are less services and less activities happening. So we included 3 governorates, which are Diyala, Anbar, and Basra. And the results of the assessment will also be shared in the chat box. And it's really interesting to share with you the preliminary figures that we found out, where a sweeping majority of people that we spoke to thought that the idea of the programs that we were proposing to them, combining elements of both MHPSS and livelihoods, 98% found it a good idea to have both being provided together, and 93% said that they would participate in such activities. And it was also very interesting because for you who are probably on the livelihood side, we know that livelihood opportunities have an assumed benefit of improving one's financial status. And we think that sometimes when people are either offered one service or the other, they would go for the livelihoods one. But I think it's really interesting that 70% of the respondents acknowledge that their psychosocial well-being affects their ability to work and perform on a job, which is something that we also used in how we designed the program and how we took this forward to the implementation and the piloting phase. This concludes my part in the presentation for today. Thank you very much. And I hand over back to Heide.
Thank you, Hatem, for sharing a bit the background of how this whole program started and what is the idea and how we think it links to peace building. And I was very happy to see that actually in the assessment that the respondents clearly made that link between psychosocial well-being and their ability to work, to perform in a job, which then also means, as you said earlier, to run a successful business, to take care of the family, but also to be able to contribute in a positive and constructive way to the community and community activities. So I think this is a very important outcome of the assessment that supports our thinking of not just seeing it as two separate activities or areas, but to see how can we strengthen the outcomes of both by providing them in an integrated way. You also mentioned specific marginalized groups and vulnerable groups that you included in Iraq. So now, like, your focus is on internally displaced populations. How do you think this specific group actually benefits from an integrated approach? What is the added value?
Right, thank you, Heidi, for this question. I think it's important to think that a lot of the IDP situation in Iraq has been the product of years of conflict and, you know, several conflicts happening in different geographical areas. So I believe the added value of including IDPs and then, you know, as they go through the process of return and reintegration to the areas of origin would be securing their ability to return to their areas of origin with more opportunities to, let's say, resume their life again in those areas by being provided with both a livelihood opportunity, as well as the tools that would help them overcome the stresses that they've been through the process of displacement, readjust again to the community. And then on an inter-community side, it was also a good chance for us where we have worked with communities that have both members from the host community or the community that was not displaced and those who have been displaced, to also have a chance for meaningful exposure between those communities and building trust again. And it's hard to say, or it would be actually difficult to say, how can we, at this stage, look at the IDP situation without thinking of providing them with a mix of both opportunities, because they've been through very dire financial situations. They've been unable to work, even though some of them were quite qualified. And then, you know, they're returning to the areas of origin with basically nothing in many cases. So that was really our reason to focus on that group. Over.
Yeah, thank you for your answer. And yeah, and as you mentioned, it's a very important point. The return often only happens not only if people feel safe, but also if they have access to services or are able to provide for the families. So that's an important condition actually for people being able or willing to go back to the area of origin. So this is where livelihood comes in. Thanks for clarifying this also in terms of how you work with IDP and host communities. I think this is also interesting for a lot of people who work in the IDP context. There are many other contexts where this livelihood integration could actually be used or applied. And before I hand over to Julie, I want to invite everyone to use the chat box to ask questions, maybe also provide examples of your work environment. Do you think it's something that is feasible in your work environment? Do you think it's interesting? So that at the end we get the chance to look at your questions and comments and to bring you a little bit in the chat room, because I mean, it's as we cannot have an open dialogue, we will do it through the comments and the questions. So please feel free to join us through your questions and comments. We now want to have a closer look at the approach itself, how it was implemented. Looking at the different elements, and I want to introduce Julie. Julie Meyer manages the IOM Iraq MHPSS and Livelihood Integration Programming with activities, as Hatem mentioned already, in Basra and Nineveh and Kirkuk. Previously, Julie worked on the Syrian humanitarian response with IOM based in Turkey, and she also developed mental health focused programming working with Catholic Relief Service in Iraq. She has been working on refugee and displacement issues for the past decade and is very passionate about bringing contextualized and meaningful solutions to displaced populations. And Julie's research in MHPSS is focused on MHPSS integration into humanitarian development and peacebuilding programs. And she received a master's degree in humanitarian affairs from New York University. And currently, Julie lives and works in Iraq. And yeah, I invite you, Julie, to tell us a bit more about how the approach has been implemented, yeah, to get a better understanding of the situation on the ground. Over to you.
Thank you, Heide, and thanks for the kind introduction, and also many thanks to the MHPSS and Peacebuilding Working Group for providing us with this platform today to share more about our MHPSS and livelihood integration programming at IOM Iraq. Our MHPSS and livelihood integration approach, in short MLI approach, integrates MHPSS activities into existing livelihood programs that are implemented by IOM's Return and Recovery Unit. And we generally integrate MHPSS activities either into cash for work activities that work with some of IOM's most vulnerable beneficiaries, or we integrate MHPSS activities into individual livelihood assistance projects that focus on startups and supporting new businesses across Iraq. Usually our integration programs last for 2 to 3 months, and you can see our current implementation areas on the map. In locations where there is no livelihood programs present, where there's no presence of the Return and Recovery Unit and their livelihood projects, we have started to develop standalone MHPSS and livelihood integration projects. For example, at Hassan Sham IDP camp, for example, there we have created a carpentry workshop that integrates MHPSS activities, and we're scheduled to also launch a bakery and cooking workshop next month at the camp that will include MHPSS as well as protection elements. As Hatem already mentioned, we generally implement our MLI approach and programming in areas with a heightened need for MHPSS, but also for social cohesion and peace building efforts. So we're mainly present in return and or displacement areas. Next slide, please. MHPSS and livelihood integration promotes positive outcomes for emotional well-being and employment at the same time. We know that conflict-affected individuals who engage in a new livelihood can often face daily psychosocial stressors that challenge their work opportunities or their engagement in work. We work with livelihood participants, supporting them to manage and mitigate unexpected work-related stressors. We also integrate MHPSS activities into livelihood projects to strengthen the participants' positive coping mechanisms, building their life, social, and soft skills that are essential for livelihood success. MHPSS integration also works to enhance self and community efficacy. While livelihoods as income-generating activities naturally improve mental well-being as people have their own means to survive and provide for their families, a livelihood intervention complemented by MHPSS elements can further enhance self-efficacy and ensure that a person can take full advantage of a livelihood and work opportunity. MHPSS integration into livelihood programs also works to strengthen community support and a sense of belonging. And this is especially relevant in the communities where we implement MLI in Iraq, which often face social cohesion challenges. Our MLI activities often include members of the host community, IDPs, and returnees, and we try to provide them with a safe space to meet and build supportive relationships, which I think is a key element for local peace building. Next slide, please. When we asked a question in our needs assessments about what type of MHPSS activities would be most beneficial for people that start a new job or engage in livelihoods, most answers revolved around MHPSS awareness sessions, building skills, having peer support groups, and individual counseling. So our current MLI approach in Iraq focuses on exactly these activities. We generally integrate MHPSS alongside the Livelihood Project, starting with the integration of an MHPSS awareness session very much at the beginning of the Livelihood Project, integrating that session into an induction day or an initial business training day that the Livelihood Project has set up. And then we meet with the Livelihood participants throughout the Livelihood Project, supporting them through peer support groups that focus specifically on life, social, and soft skills training. In addition, we also offer request-based individual counseling for the duration of the Livelihood Project, but also afterwards if needed. In the locations where we have MLI programming, we generally create joint MHPSS and Livelihood teams with different MLI responsibilities to successfully implement the programming. We also have joint training where we conduct trainings on MHPSS and livelihood integration for the MHPSS and livelihood staff. And the livelihood units also provide trainings to our MHPSS staff about the specific livelihood project that the participants they work with engage in. And all of our activities that we integrate are specifically adapted to the needs and the interests of livelihood participants. Next slide. We ensure that our activities are adapted to the needs and interests of livelihood participants by having created an MHPSS and Livelihood Integration Manual. This manual outlines how to effectively integrate MHPSS and livelihood support, and it also provides step-by-step guidance to MHPSS facilitators on how to conduct MHPSS activities for livelihood participants. And on the next slide, you can see 8 modules that are present in the manual and focus on different life, social, and soft skills that we think are essential for livelihood success. We generally conduct an intake assessment after our first meeting with the livelihood participants, which generally is the MHPSS awareness session. And during that intake assessment, we also ask participants what types of skills they want to build, what types of themes they would like to explore in subsequent MHPSS sessions and activities. And then we take that feedback as we structure the next sessions with a specific group, and they often focus on one or more of these modules. Next slide, please. Since late December 2020, we have been able to reach through our integrated programming 409 individuals, livelihood participants. Our MHPSS team has delivered 44 MHPSS awareness sessions to livelihood participants and 122 peer support group sessions. Our MHPSS team has also received 18 requests for individual counseling, and we have trained 67 staff on MHPSS and livelihood integration, and this includes MHPSS and livelihood staff. Next slide, please. Our current MHPSS and livelihood integration monitoring and evaluation approach includes the intake assessments that I've already mentioned, but also participant feedback evaluations and feedback focus groups, which are usually taking place after the peer support group sessions. We also conduct staff consultations with MHPSS and livelihood staff, and are working closely with the Return and Recovery Unit and the Livelihood Program to conduct joint impact assessment after our activities are completed, to also gain a better understanding around the impact that MHPSS integration has on the livelihood projects. Next slide, please. Our results are quite positive. We see a high satisfaction rates with integrated activities and a high relevance of the activities and their topics and skills building across projects. Participant feedback shows that there has been increased positive thinking and motivation to work. Especially women who have participated in our MLI projects have shared that they have increased their self-esteem and become more self-confident in themselves and their work. MHPSS sessions have also enabled and improved participants' engagement with others and teamwork, and our participants' ability to solve problems as a team or alone using the skills that were developed during our integrated activities. Participants have also shared that the MHPSS sessions have enabled them to more easily adapt to new or changing situations using positive coping mechanisms. And finally, throughout their feedback, participants have continuously shared that the MHPSS sessions have contributed to the building of social support networks and a common sense of belonging. And to illustrate that last point a bit more, the next slide includes some quotes. For example, one male MLI participant of a Cash for Work activity in West Mosul shared with us that we worked in small groups every day, but the MHPSS sessions brought us together and helped us build relationships with everyone. It improved our group work and communication together. When I was just in Zab Kirkuk the other week and visited one of our MLI activities, one of the women shared with me that she really was not comfortable working with the other women at first. But after time, she said, and with the sessions, I have been able to make friends. Now it is easier to work together. We help each other. And in addition to these two examples, I can also tell you about a group of livelihood participants who joined our MLI sessions, who started a chat group to share business and life advice. And there was also a women's group who realized very quickly, as they were meeting through our integrated sessions, that their businesses are actually very similar in Mosul. And so they decided to talk to the livelihoods team to see if they can join their businesses, and that's what ended up happening. I think forming these meaningful connections is key for community stabilization at the local level. And I think that these examples illustrate how MLI and our approach complements social cohesion efforts, providing an opportunity for lasting connections and support. Next slide, please. I want to come back briefly to the interlinkage between MLI, community stabilization, and peace building. On this slide, you can again see the different locations where we've integrated MHPSS into livelihood projects. And I've written down a few common social cohesion concerns. For example, tensions around returns, the acceptance of returnees with perceived affiliation, distrust among returnees, the host community, and IDPs, causing significant isolation, but also unequal access to basic services and employment, and generally complex social fabrics and multi-ethnic divides, especially in places like Kirkuk. I think it's important to note that by choosing to integrate MLI into our MHPSS programming and into livelihood programming in these locations, we complement the broader social cohesion efforts of IOM Iraq. Next slide, please. Research has shown over and over again that without mental and emotional well-being and no access to sustainable work opportunities, the prospects of peace at the individual and community levels remain vulnerable. Our MLI approach responds inclusively to mental health, psychosocial, livelihoods, and peace-building needs. Our approach also aims to offer a space to strengthen community support and a sense of connection and belonging, which we think are both essential for social cohesion and peace building. Next slide, please. Before I wrap up my presentation, I want to provide some thoughts on applying MLI in other settings and leave you with some key takeaways. Based on our experience at IOM Iraq, we find that the MLI approach is especially applicable in conflict-affected contexts with protracted displacement and in return areas. Integrating MHPSS into livelihood projects is also especially promising in contexts where the livelihood programs seek MHPSS integration. And this is especially important because the integrated approach very much depends on strong collaboration and coordination between MHPSS and livelihood teams. MLI provides us with a holistic response approach, creating opportunities for work while strengthening well-being and resilience at the same time. Integrating MHPSS into livelihood programs also allows for more sense of community and belonging, and through MLI we have a complementary programming to support social cohesion and peace-building efforts. I'll leave it at that and hand it back over to Heide. Thank you so much.
No, thank you, Julie, for this presentation. I think which provided us with a lot of insight on details on how the program was put together and is implemented in the different communities. I think that's very interesting to see, and also to get the voices from participants, and that shows how actually those interventions have made a change in their life. I'm seeing in the chat box there are quite a number of questions coming in, and a lot are linked to actually what you have just explained in terms of how is it implemented, what are your criteria, for example, for selection. I will go into those questions so that we can dive a bit deeper into the implementation, which I think a lot of people are interested. They want to know concretely how is it done and how can I do it maybe in my own project. But before we go there, I wanted to see, okay, Julie, from your point of view, what do you thought was very challenging in the implementation? Because I mean, yeah, it's a pilot study. It's a lot of lessons learned and a lot of adaptation of the program throughout the process. What comes to mind?
Thank you, Heide. Yeah, it's a good question, and it's certainly we're adapting constantly to improve our programming to make it as effective as it can be. Some of the challenges we've identified very early on is that participants had a very difficult time differentiating between the MHPSS and livelihood teams, and that became very stressful for the participants, but also for our MHPSS staff who just weren't able to respond to inquiries about the livelihood project. And in order to address this, what we've done is we've included a segment on the function and responsibilities of each team into our MHPSS awareness sessions. And in addition to that, after every MHPSS group activity that we integrate, we have at the very end a livelihood associate join to answer any livelihood related questions. And this has taken a lot of pressure away from our MHPSS team and colleagues, but also been very helpful to the livelihood participants who are given a space to really focus on their emotional well-being, on psychosocial skills building, knowing that at the end of the session they will be able to ask their specific livelihood related questions. And I think that shows, it's a good example, I think, to see how we reacted to a challenge that we identified early on and tried to mitigate and make it easier for everyone by working even more closely with livelihood colleagues.
Yeah, thank you, Julie. And I think I would love to come back to that question actually in terms of the coordination between the teams and the language, because this is something we often discuss among MHPSS and peacebuilding practitioners. But I first want to go back to the questions from the chat box and give them back to you, Julie and Hatem. So in terms of the implementation, there was a question on maybe you can explore a bit more or describe how the beneficiaries are selected. So what are the criteria? And there was a question from Nenip Koshaba, World Vision. How do you select your beneficiaries based on vulnerability or suitability for livelihood and MHPSS interventions? And that would be the first question. I want to give you a few more, Julie, so you can respond to them together. There was again a question on sequencing. I think you mentioned it already, but maybe it's good to bring it up again on how the sequencing is done. And maybe you shared that MHPSS is included at the very beginning, yeah, but maybe you can explain a bit more. Is there maybe also the possibility to first do livelihood and then MHPSS? I think that's interesting for people to know how the sequencing should take place. I'm looking for the question in the name. I can't find it, but I remember the question. So this is the question. And then the third one is like maybe there was a question on whether MHPSS sessions woven into the livelihood or people were invited to participate in MHPSS. I mean, you mentioned already a bit, but maybe that is good again to explain to our audience who maybe haven't heard about all those details. So how was it done? Let me find the name of the person who's asked the question. So yeah, from Dania Fawaz, are the MHPSS sessions woven throughout the livelihoods activity, or are they separate sessions that people are invited to participate in? So those three questions for you, Julie, over to you.
Thank you, Heide. These are very good questions and very practical ones as well. I'll start with the third one. It depends a bit on the livelihood project. If we integrate MHPSS activities into Cash for Work programs, we attach the first MHPSS session, which is the awareness session, into the Cash for Work induction day. So it's woven in that regard. And then the subsequent sessions are actually integrated into the Cash for Work days. So if participants work for 6 days or for 5 days during the week, 6 hours a day, on every week or every 2 weeks, we would integrate into one of these work hours the MHPSS activities. So the participants would come to meet together in our group activities instead of working the additional hour. And it's a bit different for a livelihood project like individual livelihood assistance, where participants don't really work together. They have their own startup businesses that they're running, and they're not as engaged as a group. So what we do is we meet them during their business training, very much also at the beginning, and conduct the MHPSS awareness session then. And then for those who are interested, we will offer subsequent peer support groups on a bi-weekly basis for them to join and meet together and discuss livelihood-related stressors and build their different life, social, and soft skills. So it's a bit of a different approach, but I hope that clarifies that question a bit. I think you just have to be flexible and work with the livelihood teams to see what is possible. I think in some cases they might not be as willing to give you one work hour for the MHPSS integration, but we've been able to really work closely with our livelihood colleagues to make that integration as seamless as possible for the participants, and making sure that they're attending the MHPSS sessions is as stress-free as possible. And I guess the other question about sequencing is quite similar. We have chosen an approach where we integrate MHPSS alongside the Livelihood project, because we have found that if we meet with livelihood participants very much at the beginning, there is so much interest for them to discuss the skills they want to build, the social skills they want to build, to be more active and more motivated to work, to find ways to really, adapt to different work challenges that they're facing. So we have found it very useful to work with them very much at the beginning and then throughout their livelihood projects, which at IOM Iraq is not a very long time span. We usually work with the participants for 2 to 3 months. And of course, if there is interest, we would be open to continue the MHPSS sessions, but also our activities are sort of opening the door for them to also access MHPSS services later on. It's just an introduction in a way also for them, if they have any other psychosocial stressors later on, to come back to receive our services. But of course there are also other approaches, and I think it really depends on the partnership that you build with your livelihood partners, whether you integrate MHPSS first or after, or concurrently with the livelihood opportunities. And then in regards to our selection, it's again also different. It depends. When we integrate MHPSS activities into livelihood projects that are run by the Return and Recovery Unit at IOM Iraq, the selection process has already happened once we meet with the participants, and the Return and Recovery Unit and the Livelihood team, they're responsible for selecting participants based on vulnerability, based on skills. So you would usually find less skilled participants in a cash for work program, but they're highly vulnerable. And then we would have people who are able to start their own businesses but are still vulnerable, who might be participating in an individual livelihood program. At Hassan Cham Camp, where we have our standalone MHPSS and Livelihood Integration programming, we set up the MLI application form and scoring. We use a scoring system to select the most vulnerable participants for our programming. We look at different factors, criterias. We include people with disabilities, people who are referred to us from protection, severe MHPSS cases who our team thinks could really benefit from the integrated programming. So we have different approaches, again, depending on what type of livelihood program we're integrating our MHPSS into.
Thank you for clarifying those different aspects, and I see a lot of interest from participants to have a look at the manual, and colleagues have just shared that it's not yet published online, so it's not yet available. We are really presenting something that is work in progress. And also in terms of the data, I saw questions on what is other differences in terms of outcomes or results for different groups. I don't think we have that data yet. Maybe Julie, you want to just briefly, before I hand over to Hatem for probably one of the last questions, maybe you can respond to that question in terms of outcomes. Do you see any differences in terms of the result of the programming, depending on which group they belong to or which activity they are doing at the moment?
I think the difference could be in what types of skills participants want to build. And in terms of the outcomes, it's been very similar, but I would like to highlight that, especially for MLI programs that have included women, there has been a strong focus on building their resilience and self-confidence as we go through the MLI project with them. And we've actually been asked by our livelihood colleagues to work more often with female or with women's projects, just because they do see that there is a high need among women as they start their new work opportunities to build confidence, to really feel that they can do the work and engage in the work opportunity that they're receiving. So I think there is a lot of opportunity for MLI, especially with women, just working together with them to build their confidence, the confidence in their work, and so on.
Thank you, Julie. And there was a question from Camille Cheval. I have another one for Hatem. I see we have only a few minutes left, so I'm almost wrapping up here, but I think it's interesting. Tina Hokanen had a question on people with severe mental disorders, which of course is a group that is close to our heart, but not always easy to integrate in running activities. So her question is, does IOM have experience of livelihood interventions for beneficiaries living with severe mental disorders like schizophrenia?
Thank you, Heidi, and thank you, Tina, for this question. At this stage, we haven't had this as a part of our programming. I agree with you, Heidi. It's a group that is often missed in several interventions, and it would be great looking at this opportunity. However, as we highlighted and as Julie probably mentioned a lot in her presentation, at this stage of the programming, we want to have an integrated approach, and we thought it would be easier to have the livelihoods program on board if we start on their site first. So we have their existing program and we try to support them with their existing activities and integrate the MHPSS to be woven into the activities that they already have. But I think what Tina is mentioning is a very interesting perspective that we also have. But I think we need to have this up and running more common so that we can have also the trust of the colleagues on the livelihood side and the practice going on where we have both activities together so that we can also make them more accessible for people living with severe mental disorders.
Yeah, this is well understood, and yeah, it's also to see how the program develops in the future and to see how we can create opportunities. Julie mentioned already, we try to integrate people with disabilities and other vulnerabilities, and probably in the future also people with severe mental disorders, or hopefully giving them proper framework. Thank you all for all the questions. Just in general, I saw questions also on, will people continue to get MHPSS services after the livelihood programming? Yes, there is a fully fledged program available through IOM Iraq. And as you see, like this specific approach, as Julie said, is for 3 months. So during that time, if people don't move from one place to another, they can participate. But even afterwards, IOM will be there with transition and recovery activities and MHPSS. Thank you all for your interest. And Nanda, over to you. We're coming to an end. And yeah, here are our contacts in case you want to reach out to us with further questions or remarks. We are looking forward to hear from you. Because it helps us also develop our own approach. Thanks all for joining today and for your interest in the topic, and also very much appreciated coming to join another webinar in the month of World Mental Health Day, where people are very busy. We are very aware of that. And thanks to Julie and Hatem for presenting today.
Yeah, thank you, Heide. I'd like to add on behalf of the working group, and I think everyone in the chat who's messaging that Hatem and Julie, it's been extremely interesting, a very clear and promising case example that's given us both conceptual and very sort of practical linkages between MHPSS and peace building via livelihoods work. And Heide, of course, thanks for your moderation of the session. And to everyone who joined us today, thanks for attending. Please do join us next time. Take the exit survey, which we just shared the link of in the chat. My colleague Aloka will do that again now. And also do join us next time, or via the community of practice link that we've also shared, and we'll repost and do just note that we also because of the time, we didn't speak too much about it earlier, but there is an ongoing initiative through the IC reference group to develop guidance for actors in the field to link or integrate the methods and goals of MHPSS and peace building. And Mike Wessels and Raksha Suleon, who are on the call, and Raksha's just also messaged in the chat, have invited us to participate in this through a global survey that we really hope you'll take. It'll be so helpful if you're able to. And yeah, thanks so much for joining. Take care.